Bear Island. It has no permanent population. No trees. No soil. Just bare rocks, freezing fog, and the skeletons of abandoned buildings. For most of history, this island was a secret. Then, in the 20th century, it became a battlefield. Not with soldiers. Not with bombs. A silent war. A war nobody won. Bear Island is not large. Just 178 square kilometers. Most of it is flat, stony tundra. In winter, everything is buried under snow and ice. In summer, the fog rolls in so thick that you cannot see your own hand. The only living things are birds. Millions of them. Guillemots. Puffins. Kittiwakes. They nest on the cliffs by the hundreds of thousands. The island belongs to Norway. But it sits on the edge of Russian waters. And for decades, that has been the problem. To understand why Bear Island became a forbidden zone, you have to go back to the 1920s. The Soviet Union was new. It was hungry for resources. Coal. Fish. Minerals. The waters around Bear Island were rich with all three. The Soviets began sending expeditions. They built small camps. They raised the Soviet flag. They declared the island part of their territory. Norway protested. The League of Nations got involved. In 1922, a treaty was signed. Bear Island would remain Norwegian. But the Soviets would be allowed to fish in its waters. It was a compromise. No one was happy. The Soviets stayed. They built weather stations, radio towers, military outposts. The Norwegians watched. They could do nothing. The island was too remote, too expensive to police. By the 1940s, the Soviets had built a small settlement on Bear Island. A few wooden houses. A pier. A coal mine. The miners were prisoners. Political dissidents. Criminals. People Stalin wanted to disappear. They worked in the mines. They lived in the barracks. They died of cold and malnutrition. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the hillside. The graves are still there. Overgrown. Forgotten. After World War II, the Cold War began. Bear Island became a listening post. The Soviets installed radar, eavesdropping equipment. They watched the skies for American bombers. They listened to NATO communications. The Norwegians knew. They could do nothing. The island was too far. Too dangerous. Then, in the 1950s, something changed. The Soviets stopped bringing prisoners to Bear Island. The mining operations shut down. The weather station continued to operate. But something else was happening. Something secret. In the 1970s, a Soviet research vessel anchored off Bear Island. The crew went ashore. They found the abandoned mining camp, the weather station, the graves. And then they found something else. A cave. Not a natural cave. A man-made one. Carved into the permafrost. Inside, they discovered equipment. Documents. Evidence of a secret project the Soviets had never revealed. It was a biological weapons laboratory. Built in the 1950s. Hidden in the Arctic. Forgotten for 20 years. The scientists on the research vessel were horrified. They reported what they found to Moscow. Within weeks, the cave was sealed. The documents were removed. The entire site was classified. To this day, no one knows exactly what was developed there. But the locals have stories. Stories of strange illnesses among the miners. Of men who withered away without explanation. Of experiments on prisoners. On animals. Icelandic fishermen who worked near Bear Island in the 1960s reported strange things. Soviet patrol boats that appeared without warning. Men in hazmat suits who came ashore and took away boxes. Equipment that hummed with electricity, even though the island had no power grid. One fisherman claimed he saw a helicopter land on the island in the middle of winter. The pilot and passengers wore masks. They stayed for only 20 minutes. Then they took off and flew toward Russia. The fishermen reported this to Norwegian authorities. They never received a reply. After the Cold War ended in 1991, Bear Island opened up. Briefly. For a few years, scientists and journalists were allowed to visit. They took photographs. They collected samples. They published reports. In 2002, a Norwegian team conducted a soil survey on Bear Island. They found traces of heavy metals. Mercury. Lead. Cadmium. The levels were too high for a place that had no industry. The team also found traces of biological agents. Bacteria that had been genetically modified. Bacteria that did not belong in Arctic soil. The team published their findings in a scientific journal. Within months, the journal was classified. The article disappeared from the internet. The scientists were told not to speak about their work. The Norwegian government announced plans to turn the island into a nature reserve. Tourists would come. Birdwatchers. Hikers. The plans never happened. In 2010, a German journalist traveled to Bear Island. He had obtained permission from the Norwegian government. He spent 3 days on the island. He took photographs. He interviewed the weather station staff. He tried to find the cave. He could not. The area was cordoned off. Fenced. Guarded by motion sensors. The journalist asked the weather station staff about the cave. They refused to answer. They said they had been told not to discuss it. In 2020, Norway announced that Bear Island would remain closed. No new permits. No new visitors. The official reason was environmental protection. The birds. The fragile tundra. But the island had been isolated for decades. The birds had survived. Something else was happening. Today, Bear Island is monitored by satellites. The old Soviet buildings are still there. The weather station is still operating, run by a small team of Russian and Norwegian scientists. But access is strictly controlled. Visitors are rare. Journalists are not welcome. The cave is sealed. The mines are flooded. And the secrets of the biological laboratory remain buried. What was developed on Bear Island? Why did the Soviets hide it? And why, 30 years after the Cold War ended, is the island still off limits? The official answers are vague. Environmental protection. Safety concerns. But the real answers lie under the permafrost. Locked in the cave. Buried with the men who worked there. There are theories. Some say the Soviets were developing weaponized anthrax. Strains that could survive Arctic temperatures. Strains that could be loaded into missiles and fired across the North Pole. Others say the laboratory was a cover for something else. A listening post for submarine communications. A testing ground for Arctic warfare technology. The truth is lost. The documents are classified. The men who worked there are dead. Bear Island remains a mystery. A place out of reach. A remnant of a war that never ended. A warning about how easily governments hide their crimes. Subscribe to Echoes of the Lost. Turn on the notification bell. And do not forget to listen to What History Left Behind. This was Bear Island, the Arctic outpost that kept its secrets.